Judge Patricia Morrison wasn't supposed to cry in court, but when she looked at the elderly defendant sitting quietly before her, being accused of stolen valor by an aggressive young prosecutor who had never seen a day of combat, she felt her throat tighten, because she had heard that name before. Frank Donovan, not in a case file, not in a legal document, but in her father's voice, at the dinner table, in the hospital, on his deathbed. There was a man, her father had whispered, gripping her hand with what little strength he had left. Lieutenant Donovan, Frank Donovan, he saved us. He saved me. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have made it home. You wouldn't be here. Her father had died in 2015. Lung cancer. Agent Orange exposure from Vietnam, Sergeant Thomas Morrison. He had served with the 1st Cavalry Division, 1969 to 1970. He'd come home broken, spent years putting himself back together, but he always spoke of one man with absolute reverence, Lieutenant Frank Donovan. Now, that man sat in her courtroom, old, quiet, being accused of fraud by a prosecutor who had never seen war. Morrison's hand moved to the small locket around her neck. Inside was a photo of her father in uniform, young and proud. On the back, in his handwriting, I came home because of Donovan. She looked at the defendant, looked at the prosecutor, still ranting about documentation and stolen valor and federal crimes, and she made a decision. 2 weeks earlier, Riverside County Courthouse was one of California's busiest traffic courts. Over 200 cases a day, speeding violations, parking tickets, occasionally DUI. Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over this court for 15 years. Fair, fast, efficient, not emotional, professional. But this morning was different. Morrison sat in her chambers, a coffee in hand, her father's old photograph on her desk. Today was the anniversary of his death, 7 years. And every year, on this day, Morrison took a few minutes to remember him. In the photo, her father was young, maybe 23. His uniform was dirty, his face tired, but he was smiling. Other soldiers stood beside him, all muddy, all exhausted. In the background, a helicopter. On the back of the photo, in her father's handwriting, 1st Cavalry Division, Firebase Apache, February 1970. The man on the far right is Lieutenant Frank Donovan. He saved us that day. He saved me. If it wasn't for him, Patricia wouldn't have been born. Every time Morrison read it, she couldn't hold back tears. When her father died, she'd found this photo in his military box next to his medals, among his letters, and since then, she'd always carried it with her. She heard a knock. Her clerk Sarah opened the door. "Judge Morrison, are you ready? First case starts at 10. Morrison put the photo in her drawer. "Yes, I'm coming." That day she heard 4,777 cases. Routine, boring. But then it came. Case number 2,847, Frank Donovan, 76, speeding violation on Route 50. Morrison opened the file. Standard fine, $250. Defendant had requested veterans discount. Discounted price, $150. Simple. Routine. She'd sign it, move to the next one. But then the prosecutor stood up. Derek Chen, 28 years old, 2 years with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. Harvard law graduate, ambitious, bright, and chasing media attention. "Your Honor, I'd like to contest the veteran's discount request." Morrison frowned. This was rare in traffic court. "On what grounds?" "Lack of documentation," Chen said with hidden pride in his voice. "Mr. Donovan claims military service but has provided no proof. In this climate of stolen valor, I believe we must verify such claims." Morrison looked at the defendant. An old man sat there, hands on the table, silent. 76 years old, thin build, white hair. He wore a simple suit, old but clean. His face was calm, his eyes tired. "Mr. Donovan," Morrison said, "do you have discharge papers? A DD-214? Frank Donovan slowly shook his head. "No, Your Honor." "Why not?" "Lost in a fire, 1985. My house burned. I lost my wife. I lost everything. His voice was low, emotionless, as if talking about that loss still hurt. Morrison paused. A flicker of empathy showed in her eyes, but Chen immediately jumped in. "Your Honor," Chen stepped forward, now playing to the courtroom. A news crew sat in the back row, he'd called them. "The fire story's very convenient, isn't it? I don't have documents because there was a fire. A classic excuse. I've done research. Stolen Valor cases are full of such stories." Morrison's brow furrowed. "Mr. Chen, that's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence?" "Absence is evidence, Your Honor," Chen said confidently. "This man provides no proof, no documents, no witnesses, just a fire story. And those badges," he pointed to the faded military pins on Frank's lapel, "those sell online for $20. Frank Donovan didn't move, didn't raise his head, just sat, calm, silent. Morrison looked at him. There was something in the old man's posture, the way he sat. He wasn't defending himself, wasn't arguing, just waiting, patiently, quietly. Her father had been like that. When accused, when attacked, he never responded loudly. He'd just sit quietly, waiting for the storm to pass. "Mr. Donovan," Morrison said softly, "don't you want to defend yourself?" Frank slowly raised his head. His blue eyes met Morrison's, and in those eyes, Morrison saw something. Exhaustion. Deep, bone-deep exhaustion. But also peace. The peace of a man who had nothing left to prove. "What's the point, Your Honor?" Frank said quietly. "He doesn't want to believe. If he wants proof, I can't provide it. That fire, 1985. It took everything. My wife, my memories, my documents. All that's left is this." He touched the pin on his lapel. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Combat Infantryman Badge. But these aren't proof either, are they? Just pieces of metal. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just acceptance. Chen immediately pounced. "There! Do you hear? He can't prove it. Your Honor, this man is a fraud. And if we allow this, how many real veterans will be harmed? How many frauds will exploit the system?" Morrison's hand unconsciously went to the locket. Her father's locket, the photo inside. That name. Lieutenant Frank Donovan. It couldn't be. Could it? "Mr. Donovan," Morrison said carefully, "can you tell me about your service?" Frank nodded. "1st Cavalry Division, 1968 to 1971, Vietnam. Started as enlisted, became officer candidate in 1969. Discharged as lieutenant." Morrison's heart raced. 1st Cavalry, 1969. Her father's division, her father's year. "What operations were you in?" Frank's eyes drifted away. Memories returning, unwanted. "Many. Tet Offensive, patrols near Hamburger Hill, but the worst. Firebase Apache, February 1970. Morrison's breath caught. Firebase Apache. Her father's nightmares. Until the end of his life, he'd wake in sweats screaming, "Apache! Apache!" "Continue," Morrison whispered. Chen tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Sit down." Morrison's voice hardened, freezing Chen. Frank continued, his voice now drifting somewhere else, another time. "Firebase Apache, small outpost, 120 men. We were under siege there for 7 days. North Vietnamese army had us surrounded. Hundreds, maybe thousands. We had no air support. We were running out of ammunition. Every night they attacked. Every night we lost men." The courtroom fell silent. Even Chen quieted. "The 7th day," Frank continued, his voice cracking, "they made the big push. Before dawn, thousands, mortars exploding around us, automatic rifle fire, screams. Our left flank collapsed, right flank collapsed. Center was holding but barely. Our commander was killed. Our radio operator was killed. I took command. I was 23 years old. And around me, my men were dying." Frank stopped, closed his eyes, took a deep breath. "Over 30 wounded. We couldn't carry them, couldn't defend. I called for helicopters, but the pilot refused. Too dangerous, he said. Landing zone too hot. I said, If you don't come, 120 men will die here. Finally, he came. One pilot. A brave pilot. He landed in the middle of that hell. Morrison's hands began to tremble. I started carrying the men, one by one, wounded first, the most critical first. There was a sergeant, young, maybe 22, shot in the leg but still firing. His name was Thomas Morrison. Morrison's world stopped. That kid, Frank smiled through tears. He was incredible, wounded, bleeding, but still keeping morale up. "Lieutenant," he said to me, "if we get out of here, I owe you a beer." I said, "Sergeant, we're getting out, I promise." Morrison couldn't breathe. And we did. I got him on the helicopter. He was one of the last. He looked at me, squeezed my hand and said, "Lieutenant, you still owe me that beer." I said, "Sergeant Morrison, when we get home, I'll buy you a barrel." Silence. Absolute silence. Morrison stood, her legs trembling. "Court is in recess, now." Chen was confused. "But, Your Honor." "Now." Morrison slammed the gavel, stumbled toward the back room. She entered the room, closed the door, leaned against the wall. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was tight. Tears flowed uncontrollably. It was him, that lieutenant, the man who saved her father, the man her father always talked about. If it wasn't for Donovan, her father's last words, and now that man, in her courtroom, was being accused of fraud. She heard a knock. Sarah opened the door. "Judge Morrison, are you okay?" Morrison turned, her face covered in tears. "Sarah, get me my father's file, military records, photos, everything, in my office, locked drawer, get the key, urgent." Sarah nodded, ran off. 5 minutes later, Sarah returned with an old box. Morrison opened it with trembling hands. Inside were her father's letters. Letters he'd sent home from the war, photos, medals, and journals. Morrison opened a journal, her father's handwriting. Date, February 15th, 1970. "Today I lived through hell. Firebase Apache. 7 days under siege. The 7th day I thought it was my last. Shot in the leg, bleeding, my friends dying around me. But Lieutenant Donovan, that man is an angel. He never left us. He called the helicopter. Then, under fire, he carried us one by one. He carried me last." "Sergeant Morrison," he said, "I'm getting you out of here, I promise." And he did. That man saved my life. If I ever see him again, I'll kneel and thank him. Morrison pressed the journal to her chest and cried. She hadn't cried like this in years, not since she lost her father. 10 minutes later, she washed her face, fixed her makeup, took a deep breath, and carrying the box, returned to the courtroom. "Court is in session," she said, sitting. Her voice was different now, stronger, but also fragile. "Mr. Chen," Morrison looked at the prosecutor, "I have a question for you. Did your father go to war?" Chen frowned. "No, Your Honor, but this is irrelevant." "My father did," Morrison interrupted. "Vietnam, 1969 to 1970, Sergeant Thomas Morrison, 1st Cavalry Division, wounded at Firebase Apache. He came home, raised me, sent me to school, sent me to law school, saw me become a judge, and died in 2015. The courtroom froze. "And before he died," Morrison continued, her voice trembling, "he told me something about the man who saved his life, Lieutenant Donovan, Frank Donovan, at Firebase Apache. If that lieutenant hadn't been there, my father wouldn't have come home. I wouldn't have been born." Chen's face went white. Morrison stood. Slowly, she pulled her father's photo from the box, walked to the defense table, stood before Frank Donovan. "Mr. Donovan," she said, voice cracking, "do you recognize this photo?" Frank looked at the photo. His eyes widened. His hand reached out trembling, took the photo. "Firebase Apache," he whispered. "February 1970. This is us. This is me." He pointed to the young lieutenant, then touched another face. "And this, Sergeant Morrison. Thomas. Yes, Morrison whispered. My father. Frank looked up, eyes wet. You're his daughter? Morrison nodded. Thomas, Frank's voice broke. How is he? He died in 2015, Morrison said softly. But before he died, every day he talked about you. He never forgot you. He was always grateful that you saved his life. Frank closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. I tried to find him, for years, but I'd lost his address. Then the fire happened. Everything was gone. I lost hope. Morrison, under the shocked gaze of everyone in the courtroom, slowly rendered a sharp, perfect military salute. Lieutenant Donovan, she said, voice cracking, on behalf of my father, as my father's daughter, thank you for giving my father life, for giving me a father. Frank stood, two people, judge and veteran, embraced in the middle of the courtroom, in tears. The courtroom erupted in applause. News cameras went wild. Chen sat, face pale, destroyed by shame. Morrison composed herself, returned to her seat, looked at Chen. Mr. Chen, she said, voice now cold and hard, you accused this man of fraud. You called the media. You used him to advance your career. But you didn't know that this man is a real hero, not just of my father, but of hundreds, and you humiliated him. Chen bowed his head. The ruling of this case, Morrison raised the gavel. The speeding violation fine is completely dismissed. We owe Mr. Donovan a formal apology. This court, this country, owes him, and Mr. Chen, you will come to my office immediately. The gavel's sound echoed. Aftermath. The story went national. Real hero accused of stolen valor. Judge recognizes her own father's lifesaver. On every news channel, in every newspaper. Derek Chen resigned. His legal career ended. A few months later, he wrote a private letter to Frank Donovan, apologized, asked for forgiveness. Frank wrote back, I forgive you, but remember, arrogance is the worst teacher. Patricia Morrison and Frank Donovan became friends. Every year, on the anniversary of her father's death, they'd have dinner together. They'd talk about her father, about Firebase Apache, about those terrible 7 days. And Frank, finally, found peace. Because Thomas Morrison's daughter had shown him something. He hadn't been forgotten. He was never forgotten. True heroes serve in silence, but they're never forgotten. Frank Donovan's story reminds us true heroes never boast, never demand. They live quietly. And sometimes the greatest justice comes from someone remembering. Like, subscribe and share, because every veteran deserves respect. Have you ever seen someone who helped you years later? Share below. Remember, true heroes serve quietly.